Congratulations to the United Kingdom on the spectacular Brexit, which I thought was never going to happen. Commiserations also to all those who feared that it would happen, including many Scots who now require a voice at the European Union. Yet now, you have the rarest thing on earth. You've just received your own country. Now that the UK has the task set before it of becoming again one of the tiny handful of democracies on earth, what is it moving away from or moving toward by initiating this Brexit deal? Firstly, do you feel that it may be optimal to make your own laws? Otherwise, would it be like living in a house where you don't know the owner, nothing belongs to you, and you can't touch anything? Secondly, is the ability to trade freely, make your community prosperous, both locally and globally, fundamental to any form of sustainable human society? And as constant trade has been going on between Britain and continental Europe since before recorded history, have you really appreciated being told whom you could trade with and what and how you could do it? Globalization, meanwhile, has entered such a phase of corruption, as exemplified by the European Union, but also, until recently, by the United States, that the only conceivable way of remedying it has been to think of the dying paradigm of the nation-state, which many hoped was dead already. But just like Jesus, the nation-state has been resurrected and has come again to bring calm amid the storm. As we move, inexorably in a technological sense, but really in a teetering way from an ethical standpoint, towards something that many people refer to but has never yet been seen, and that is a global world. So did the EU make a global world with cultural transfer and mixing and cosmopolitanism of peoples? Or do we have parochialization in each country, isolation, freedom in name only, Little Britain times 100? And where has the cultural exchange gone, in particular between countries, for example, like Britain and France, which so embellished the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, by now almost dead? To get back to the teething of globalization, one prerequisite is certainly some kind of sense of self-determination and consent, with the moderate checks and balances and limits on crime and corruption that democracies have sometimes demonstrated in the past. And until then, why not enjoy and maximize the compelling cultural differences between nations, which are true diversity, and gain strength from learning by cooperating, rather than trying to deplatform every wrinkle of difference in the space-time continuum, leaving lowest common denominator shadow cultures that are sad monuments of a civilization that was. And thirdly, immigration. Is it not desirable to control who comes in and who participates in your brand and your specific value sets, which anyone joining needs to accept, to grow with, and to evolve as a participant at the heart of the existing culture? Entertaining objectives and shared beliefs enables you to swim, whereas anyone claiming victimhood leaves you underwater. Has there been, and is there, an enormous disaster in continental EU countries in terms of the lack of cohesion and lack of safety in society? And yet, perhaps for the UK as an island nation, is the issue more the disaster of people who are already legitimately there? So what are some of the issues facing people who are already justifiably in the United Kingdom? Firstly, honest working people of all skin tones, religions and backgrounds have been snubbed by the political establishment for many years. These are the very people who've seen their livelihoods snatched away under the economic and social dictatorship of the Union. Anyone complaining about this state of affairs, the death of the middle class, the impoverishment of the working class, the pursuit of unbridled and corrupt corporate globalism with chasmic disparity, has been shamed and cast aside as a white supremacist, or just ignored if they're not considered white enough to be dubbed a racist, Or how about being slotted into token positive discrimination roles to replace, by now, unemployable and undesirable whites, particularly males, in a successful bid to make sectarianism or identity politics into the new black? And it seems self-evident that if you want a global elite, your primary target is white males, just as Jews were the primary target when Hitler and co. wanted a Third Reich. Secondly, the onslaught of Islamic fundamentalism and related violence has created a climate of fear, mutual distrust, and outrage, in which the majority of ordinary, peace-observing, moderate Muslims have started to become persecuted, supposedly for belonging to that cult of death. And the majority of working people at large have felt totally powerless to do anything to stop it. Because there is the very real danger of being criminally apprehended for transmitting the leprosy of Islamophobia. As for radicalization, it's very easy to radicalize anyone. One thing is clear: when you take away the last drop of hope from anybody's cup, you can be sure that pretty soon they will be trying to get rid of you. So in a society divided by mistrust and rage, there is a need to actually be able to mention that Islamic fundamentalism exists and figure out whether the Sharia is something you want or not, before patronizing the rest of the world about human rights. Thirdly, it seems that predominantly black, but also white working class youths have been both the perpetrators and the primary victims of knife crime, particularly in London, which has become the knife crime capital of the world. And as such, this has resulted in youths being stopped and searched all over the place without cause or warrant. This police state and putting people in prison or letting them go with a spanking all make the problem exponentially worse, instead of dealing with the cause. It is with deep shame that I note that you cannot call a country of which the capital city is the knife crime capital of the entire world a civilized or democratic country. Those epithets are totally incompatible. Last but not least, we have the stunning rise of so-called anti-Semitism, which means brutal violence and constant physical threats against Jewish people. It is, of course, very understandable that by now the majority viewpoint, whether it's allowed to be expressed publicly or not, is that Jewish people are pursuing their Zionist conspiracy with great success, which is reducing almost everyone else to suffering. This tragic misconception springs, among other things, from the high achievements of the Jewish community in political, academic, artistic, and business life, proportionately or disproportionately, given their very small number in any given country, together with systematic gross misrepresentation of the State of Israel by the European Union since the birth of that union in 1993, and by the United Nations and by mass media for geopolitical reasons of the Middle Eastern balance of power. You would think that Israel was bigger and more dangerous than Belgium. Gooi weh! But it's education and communication, and not banning freedom of speech, that's going to check the recurrent and mutating virus of anti-Semitism. And as history has shown time and time again, every time the Jewish community runs for its life, it's very bad news for the former host nation. So what are some solutions? In passing, I've become aware of a doctrine which has been dubbed scientific racism, in which a hierarchy of races is supposed to explain ethnic incompatibility in given territories. It may be an alluring idea at first glance, yet it's also a nonsense fairy story about eugenics, which belongs frankly with the National Socialists in the Germany of World War II. Nothing explains anyone's behavior, as well as recent cultural background, education, integration or lack of it into society, outlook for the future, a handful of psychological anomalies, and above all, of course, income versus cost of living. Meanwhile, the predominantly white, but not exclusively white, middle-class intellectual terrorists have increasingly attempted to tear any semblance of civilization to shreds with their incessant isms and phobias and privileges and gaps, and their lip-service diversities and equalities and every kind of white-shaming propaganda imaginable, in a world where racism is the norm, and where the first world is becoming the third with its newfound racial obsession. Yes, whilst proclaiming itself the unelected bureaucracy guarantor of all human rights, the European Union has been very busy taking all visible human rights away. Some of us fondly remember the European Economic Community, or EEC, which the UK signed up to, and which many will justifiably criticise, and yet which brought with it a fantastic sense of optimism and many potential benefits, facilitating trade and exchange across the continent and including Britain, that most quintessentially European of nations. Meanwhile, not one electorate signed up for the European Union. All the nations who were asked whether they consented to joining the EU rejected it steadfastly, and yet every state proceeded to become a member of the EU. Just like the deeply flawed MCAS software stealthily made its way into the 737 MAX aircraft, without constituent knowledge or consent. And now the EU wants its own army, navy and air force. This is far worse than Hitler, who was very loudly, openly and democratically elected. So should we spend 100% of our time demonizing and scapegoating everyone, as the media blueprint dictates we should? Or is that one of the easiest things in the world to do, and very probably the most useless? Now there is an opening to rebuild a prosperous nation and prosperous nations which have no room for self-cannibalizing social disaster areas of decline management. There is no sustainable vacuum in this world, because as soon as a vacuum appears, something has to fill it, good or bad, and the choice of the filling, of course, is ours. And when the Anglosphere, massively powerful and overwhelmingly influential throughout the world, is not democratic or free, there can be no democracy or freedom anywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, developed Western nations have the responsibility of promulgating the role models, the methodologies and the benchmarks to every corner of the globe for peace and prosperity to exist, which does not mean the plundering of the nations of the world in the name of human rights as dictated by unelected bureaucrats who live in a neverland. For example, the former British colonies of Burma, aka Myanmar, and Hong Kong, have been crying out for support and for partnership from their former colonial masters, but no support is forthcoming from a self-loathing nation, the UK, world leader in political correctness, that is ashamed of its glorious, charitable and bloody colonial past. Far from it. Rather than accept any moral responsibility, we would much rather condemn Myanmar to eternal poverty and civil war, and Hong Kong to the angst of isolated chaos. Looking to the immediate future now, we hope that Britain will immediately re-establish close working ties with its Commonwealth acolytes, hitherto taboo for so many years under the post-colonial EU, but sharing in common history, reminiscent of familiar cultures, exciting cuisines, and diverging yet mutually compatible ways of understanding world events. Being the epicenter of Europe, Great Britain can also strike up deeper and more meaningful friendships with its surrounding European-friendly nations than ever before, together with opening up the gateway to fruitful relations again with the United States. Rather than lambasting the United States, we should be playing a role of economic cooperation that the UK was doing before that role was relieved from it by an unelected elite in Brussels, Strasbourg and Luxembourg, worshipped by their impotent and powerless but privileged gravy train charade in the most complex technocracy in the history of the world. So now that Britain has left, or perhaps arrived, one can only wish the Union a swift and peaceful passing, to be interred in the graveyard of the lessons learned about authoritarians in history, and imparting just one thing. Alors, l'Union européenne est morte. Vive l'Europe et puisse-t-elle prospérer. The EU is dead. Rule Britannia. Long live Europe, and long may she prosper.